Hey Keith, so tell me about the Land Sabbath.
In the Old Testament, there was a command that was given to the Israelites, and it was a way for God to remind them that He owned the land. The Hebrews don't own the Middle East. The Promised Land is not owned by the people, it's owned by Jehovah, and He's letting His people live there. They have to follow His rules, they have to live according to His standards, and if they're willing to do that, then He'll let them stay on His property. Well, as part of their command, their covenant with Moses, is they were supposed to let the land, let the crops, let the trees rest. And it was an example of what He wanted for them. They were to work 6 days during the week, and then on the seventh day, they were to have a Sabbath and rest. Well, He wanted that for the land, and so every 7 years, they had to let the land rest 1 year, and they weren't supposed to work it. And during that time frame, there were things that were supposed to happen. Not only were Hebrew slaves released at the end of the 6th year, but they were supposed to give us a tithe. They were supposed to bring a tithe of their crops in on the 3rd and 6th year and show that they were trusting God, because they weren't going to be able to plant their crops on the 7th year. The king was supposed to bring all of the people together on that 7th year, and they were supposed to read the laws of God. The book of Deuteronomy was read from the steps of the temple in the hearing of all the people. Men and women, boys and girls were all called, and the king was supposed to read his copy of Deuteronomy to remind the people of their obligation, not only to God, but to the king. And if you look in, I think it's the 27th chapter of Deuteronomy, there are requirements. It might be 17, I'll have to look. But there are requirements for the king. The king had obligations under the covenant to the people. And so they would allow Hebrew slaves, Hebrew bondservants would receive freedom. The king was required to read the law to all the people to make sure they knew what their obligations were, and they were not supposed to go into the fields at all for a year. And they're actually doing that today in Israel, because there are so many of the Jewish Hebrew people that have come back. They have declared that this coming year is a Sabbath land year, and after October 26th of this year, 2020, no one is supposed to be able to go into their land or work their trees or do anything on their property until next year, if they want to be acceptable as kosher under their laws. Now, kosher is not a biblical term, that's a Hebrew term, but it means acceptable to God and in His service. So if I have an olive grove and I'm producing olive oil, and I want someone to use my oil in the temple in the lighting of a menorah, I have to have kosher blessings, and that would be following that Sabbath. But that command came from God, and it involved rest for the land, rest for the people. It was part of freedom for those who were in bondage, and it was a reminder of God's law for them. And I believe that Jesus began His ministry in a Sabbath year. He went through the fields with the disciples, and they ate some of the ungleaned crops, and the religious leaders got after them and said, that's for the people who need it, that's for the widows and the orphans. And Jesus said, hey, we don't have any money, so we're eligible, and they ate the food. And it gave Jesus a very large crowd of people, because all of those people were not working. They had a year off. If you have an almond grove or olives or dates or palms or wheat or barley or doing any of that agricultural stuff, you had a year off. And so it allowed them to follow Jesus and to learn of Him and hear His teachings, because it was a Land Sabbath year when He began His ministry.